At war's end, the Americans had forces on friendly terms in the United Kingdom, West Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Austria, and Norway. The European geographical advantage over the non-American world remained so huge that even in the ashes of the post-war devastation, the occupied Western European states still collectively represented 1/4 of global economic power. There was little industrial capacity outside of the United States. The United Kingdom was running at full throttle, but running at full throttle on materiel and capital provided almost exclusively by the Americans. Not only had most of the world's industrial and consumption capacity been destroyed, but the war had been so destructive that it had taken as well the bulk of the imperial militaries. Only the Soviets still had an army, but bereft of naval transport, it was an army that was not deployable in a global sense. The Americans controlled the oceans. In mid-1939, the Americans had 178 surface combatants and 58 submarines in the water out of a total fleet of less than 400 vessels. At the war's final day, only 6 years later, the Americans had a 6,800-vessel navy with over 1,000 major surface and submarine combatants. As important, the navies of every major naval combatant of every significant pre-war power had been relocated to the seabed. The United Kingdom was the sole exception, and it could no longer operate without assistance beyond European waters. For the first time since the onset of the Blue Water era in the early 16th century, there was only one navy on the oceans. It was the single greatest concentration of power that the world had ever seen. The question was what to do with the war gains. One obvious option was to absorb the Axis and Western European empires into itself and establish a Pax Americana over the global system. That's certainly what the occupied Europeans and the opposing Soviets expected. After all, it was what they had been doing to each other and all parts of the world within their reach for the entirety of the Deepwater era. But direct global control just wasn't the American style. It wasn't so much a moral distinction as a practical one. Despite America's numerical superiority vis-a-vis every foe it had battled to date, occupation doesn't play to American strengths. A Pax requires long-term occupation of key distribution and gathering nodes, large-scale urban pacification, and in general making the occupied populations offer up a sizable chunk of their wealth and income to their occupiers. Put another way, it means fighting a wide-ranging, manpower-heavy, low-intensity war of occupation. The Americans may have been numerous, but they were still maritime. Maritime powers favor highly mobile units that zip about, bringing superior firepower to discrete conflict zones, smashing foes and then flitting off before their adversaries can reposition their land-based forces. A long-term occupation would have parked U.S. detachments across the length and breadth of its new territories and compelled them to police local populations. Their mobility advantages would be surrendered. As of 1946, it was obvious that a Cold War with the Soviets was already underway. The Soviet military was not only numerically larger, but clear and extremely present across the bulk of northern Eurasia. In a Pax arrangement, the Americans would be draining money and resources from their occupied territories, so expecting Pax subjects to fight to maintain an American empire would have been a tough sell. That meant that the Americans wouldn't just need a few million men to keep the British and French and Italians and Germans and Dutch and Arabs and Persians and Indians and Indonesians and Taiwanese and Japanese and Chinese and Koreans and Filipinos in line, but that Washington would also need additional American forces in the millions to hold the defensive lines against the numerically superior Russian and Red Chinese forces. The Americans were powerful, but they just didn't have the numbers to occupy the bulk of the globe. With the Pax, the American peacetime army would have had to exceed wartime force levels. In contrast, the Soviet-Russian military was built expressly for occupation. Russia has no geographic barriers at its borders. Gaining security comes from a simple two-pronged strategy: occupying everyone nearby to secure strategic buffers, and establishing an intrusive intelligence service to infiltrate the occupied populations in order to keep them docile. The same techniques used to occupy Ukraine and Armenia in Central Asia were already being applied with brutal success in 1946 to occupy Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria and Latvia. As of the late 1940s, it was apparent that while the Americans had come in first in the war, they simply lacked the staying power to hold onto their gains in the face of strident Russian challenges backed by more men, simpler supply chains, a higher tolerance for casualties, and a practiced, casual willingness to apply massive violence to civilian populations to achieve political ends. A direct American soldier for Soviet soldier face-off couldn't be won. What the Americans needed were not just allies to help carry the defense burden, but allies who were so eager that they would be willing to stand up against the awesome force of the Red Army. A Red Army that was still roused by the fact that it had single-handedly decimated the Nazi Wehrmacht at Stalingrad. That requires a special kind of motivation. Specifically, it requires a hell of a bribe. And what the Americans came up with was one of the great strategic gambits in history. They assembled a plan, and then assembled their wartime allies on July 1, 1944, for a conference in New Hampshire to lay out their vision for the New World, which returns us to Bretton Woods. The three-point American plan was nothing short of revolutionary. They called it free trade. Access to the home market was the holy grail of the global system to that point. If you found yourself forced to give up the ability to control imports, it typically meant that you had been defeated in a major war, as the French had been in 1871, or your entire regime was on the verge of collapse, as the Turks were in the early 20th century. A key responsibility of diplomats and admirals alike was to secure market access for their country's businesses. The American market was the only consumer market of size that had even a ghost of a chance of surviving the war, making it the only market worth seeking. Previously, control of trade lanes was critical. A not insubstantial proportion of a government's military forces had to be dedicated to protecting its merchants and their cargoes, particularly on the high seas, because you could count on your rivals to use their militaries to raid your commerce. As the British Empire expanded around the globe in the 18th and 19th centuries, they found themselves having constantly to reinvent their naval strategies in order to fend off the fleets of commerce raiders that the Dutch, French, Turks, and others kept putting into play. The Americans provided their navy, the only one with global reach, to protect all maritime shipping. No one needed a navy any longer. As a final sweetener, the Americans promised to protect all members of the network from the Soviets. This included everything right up to the nuclear umbrella. The only catch was that participants had to allow the Americans to fight the Cold War the way they wanted to. Accepting the deal was a no-brainer. None of the Allies had any hope of economic recovery or maintaining their independence from the Soviets without massive American assistance. There really was no choice. Partner with the only possible consumer market, the only possible capital source, and the only possible guarantor of security, or disappear behind the Iron Curtain. As the strategic competition of the Cold War took firmer shape, the Americans were able to identify critical locations in the geopolitical contest and invite key countries to join their trading system. Among the first post-war expansions, the Americans approached none other than the defeated Axis powers. If America's Western allies thought the deal was a boon, the Germans and Japanese perceived it as too good to be true. The primary reason Germany and Japan had launched World War II in the first place was to gain greater access to resources and markets. Germany wanted the agricultural output of Poland, the capital of the Low Countries, the coal of Central Europe, and the markets of France. Japan coveted the manpower and markets of China and the resources of Southeast Asia. Now that they had been thoroughly defeated, the Americans were offering them economic access far beyond their wildest pre-war longings. Risk-free access to ample resources and bottomless markets a half a world away, and all it would cost them was accepting a security guarantee that was better than anything they could have ever achieved by themselves. Bretton Woods expanded swiftly. India joined shortly after independence, which at a minimum complicated any Soviet efforts to gain a toehold in South Asia. Sweden, which controls the bulk of the Baltic coastline and boasts a potent regional navy and air force, joined in the 1950s, denying the Soviets the ability to use the Baltic safely. Argentina's membership in the 1960s limited Soviet influence in Latin America by putting the most advanced South American power in the other camp. After the failure of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egypt jumped into the Bretton Woods pool, robbing the Soviets of their largest client state in both the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin. Indonesian, 1950, Singaporean, 1973, and Thai, 1982, membership both curtailed meaningful Soviet penetration into the most valuable portions of Southeast Asia and eliminated any hope of the Soviets exercising naval power in South or Southeast Asia. The lure of Bretton Woods proved to be the critical component that made the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s a reality. The unlikely partnership between America and China of course helped rework the strategic map of Southeast Asia in the age of Vietnam, but that was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The Soviets had plenty of Pacific coastline, but the only good ports they had access to were Chinese locales like Tianjin and Hainan Island. Once China joined Bretton Woods, the Soviet Union's only remaining deep-water ice-free port was Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula, a base so removed from Russian population centers that it could only be supplied by air. For their part, the Chinese were desperate. In the Korean War, superior American technology resulted in a 4-to-1 casualty ratio. The Chinese knew that as a maritime power, the Americans would eventually lose interest and go home. But in 1969, the Chinese had skirmished with their Soviet allies along the Ussuri River. Soviet military technology was nearly as good as American military technology, but Soviet troops didn't come by boat. They were already on the ground and there to stay. Chinese human wave tactics would be met by Soviet human wave tactics, only the Soviet waves would also have tanks and aircraft. Unless the Chinese could also change the strategic math, they faced a war on their northern border that they could not hope to win. The Chinese had to industrialize, but that required money, raw materials, technology, markets, sea lane access, and that required the Americans. But both countries also needed to change the public perception of the other. Luck intervened in 1971 at the Ping Pong World Championships in Nagoya, Japan, when U.S. team member Glenn Cohen mistakenly got on the Chinese team's bus, where he was approached by Chinese champion Zhuang Zedong. After a brief translator-assisted conversation, the two exchanged gifts and found themselves plastered across first Japanese and later global media. Time magazine called it the Ping heard around the world. Very quickly thereafter, their friendly chat segued into big-time politics. China invited the U.S. team to play a series of exhibition matches in China later that year, making the team the first Americans to visit China since the 1949 revolution. Washington's reciprocation was accompanied by an end to the trade embargo. And in February 1972, Richard Milhous Nixon up and went to China to talk about, among other things, Bretton Woods.